The year is 1865. The guns have finally fallen silent, and the thick, acrid smoke of the Civil War is beginning to lift from the American landscape. It is a time of profound fracture and fragile hope. A nation, torn asunder by 4 years of bloodshed, is attempting to stitch itself back together. In the South, the air is heavy with the scent of burnt timber and the uncertainty of a new world order. Millions of formerly enslaved men and women are taking their first, tentative breaths of freedom, stepping out from the shadows of bondage into the blinding light of an undefined future. It is against this backdrop of upheaval, where the old laws of man were crumbling, that a different kind of law was broken, a law of nature, a law of reality itself. Deep in the rugged hills of eastern Tennessee, within the borders of Warren County, the Green Plantation stood as a weathering monument to a dying era. The fields, once manicured by forced labor, were now overgrown, and the grand house peeled under the southern sun. It was here, in the chaotic aftermath of the surrender, that a child was born who would defy every explanation known to science, theology, or logic. His name was Silas Green. Born to a woman who had known nothing but chains until the very moment of his conception, Silas arrived in a world of mud and poverty. To the casual observer, he was just another child of the Reconstruction, a small, dark-skinned boy with wide, observant eyes, playing in the dust of a changing America. But Silas was different. There was a heaviness to his gaze, a silence to his demeanor that unnerved even his own mother. For the first 3 years of his life, Silas did not speak. He did not cry in the night. He did not babble or coo like other infants. He simply watched. He watched the Union soldiers patrolling the roads. He watched the weary sharecroppers toiling in the red clay. He watched the sun arc across the Tennessee sky with an intensity that suggested he was reading the very fabric of the universe. Then, in the summer of 1868, the silence broke. But it did not break with the clumsy, formative words of a toddler learning English. It broke with a torrent of impossible sound. Witnesses, ranging from illiterate farmhands to university-educated doctors and hardened Union officers, would later swear on Bibles and in affidavits that the 3-year-old boy began to speak fluently. But he was not speaking the dialect of the Tennessee hills. He was not speaking the language of his parents. Silas Green opened his mouth, and the sounds of ancient Greece, the rhythmic cadence of Arabic, and the guttural tones of long-dead dialects poured forth. He spoke 10 distinct languages, 10 languages he had never heard, 10 languages that had no business existing in the throat of a child who had never traveled beyond the fence line of the Green Plantation. Imagine the scene: a humid afternoon on the porch of a sharecropper's shack. A doctor, Elias Thorne, summoned to check on a possessed child, stands frozen, his medical bag slipping from his fingers. He listens as a toddler, barely tall enough to reach his knee, looks up at him and speaks a perfect sentence in Latin, a language the doctor had struggled to master in university. The air grows cold despite the heat. The mother weeps in the corner, terrified not of the boy, but of what resides within him. This was not a parlor trick. This was not mimicry. This was a violation of the possible. The story of Silas Green is not merely a ghost story to be told around a campfire. It is a documented anomaly that terrified a community already on edge. It is a narrative found in the scattered, yellowed pages of diaries, in the hesitant reports of military personnel who didn't know how to file a briefing on a linguistic miracle, and in the hushed folklore of Warren County. As we peel back the layers of history, we are not just looking at a strange child. We are staring into a mirror that reflects the anxieties of 1865 America, a time when the world was changing so fast that perhaps, just for a moment, the veil between the known and the unknown tore completely open. What happened on that plantation? How did a boy with no education channel the voices of the ancient world? And why did the world try so hard to forget him? Welcome to the mystery of Silas Green. To understand the story of Silas Green, we must first dismantle the conventional lens through which we view the history of the American South. Usually, when we speak of 1865, we speak of the Emancipation Proclamation, the smoke clearing from the battlefields of the Civil War, and the bitter, bloody struggle of Reconstruction. We speak of political shifts and the breaking of chains, but the story of Silas Green demands that we look beyond the physical chains and peer into a much more terrifying abyss, the limits of the human mind itself. This is not merely a chronicle of a child born into the dying breath of slavery. It is a confrontation with the impossible. It is a narrative that sits at the uncomfortable intersection of folklore and documented fact, a story that was deliberately buried because it terrified those who witnessed it. Imagine the atmosphere of Warren County, Tennessee, in that turbulent summer. The air was thick with the humidity of the South and the heavy, suffocating weight of uncertainty. The social order was collapsing. Men who had considered themselves masters of the earth were suddenly adrift, their authority shattered. Into this vacuum of power and logic stepped a 3-year-old boy who defied every rule of nature. Silas was not just a curiosity. He was a living, breathing anomaly that threatened the very fabric of reality for those around him. In a society built on the brutal dogma that a black child was intellectually inferior, a vessel to be molded for labor and nothing more, Silas Green presented a paradox that was impossible to reconcile. How could a child, born in a dirt floor cabin, possess the linguistic memories of civilizations that had crumbled to dust millennia ago? This story serves as a dark mirror reflecting the deepest anxieties of the post-war era. It reveals the fragility of what we call knowledge. For the doctors, the ministers, and the plantation owners who encountered Silas, his existence was an affront to their control. If a child from the humblest and most oppressed origin could speak with the tongues of ancient scholars and forgotten prophets, then what else about their world was a lie? We are going to explore how this anomaly exposed the deep, jagged cracks in the American psyche. We will see how the instinct of the era was not to nurture this miracle, but to dissect it, to categorize it, and ultimately, to fear it. As we journey through the life of Silas Green, we are forced to ask questions that go beyond history. We are delving into the realm of consciousness. Was this a case of genetic memory, a concept far beyond the science of the 19th century? Was it, as the religious zealots of the time claimed, a demonic possession? Or was Silas a channel for a collective human history that flows beneath the surface of our awareness, tapping into a reservoir of knowledge that we have all forgotten? The cruelty he faced was not just the cruelty of racism, though that was the bedrock of his suffering. It was the cruelty of ignorance facing the sublime. Prepare yourselves. This is not a comforting bedtime story about triumph over adversity. It is a descent into a mystery that remains unsolved. It is a study of how the unknown is treated when it appears in a form that society deems lesser. From the dusty archives of Vanderbilt University to the terrified whispers recorded in family Bibles in McMinnville, we have pieced together a picture of a phenomenon that should not have existed. We are about to walk the line between the harsh, gritty reality of the Reconstruction South and a mystical, inexplicable event that suggests our understanding of the human soul is woefully incomplete. This is the story of Silas Green, a child who spoke the world's history before he had even seen the world. The summer of 1862 in Warren County, Tennessee, was not merely hot. It was a suffocating blanket of humidity and fear that clung to the skin of every living soul. While the nation was tearing itself apart in the bloody throes of the Civil War, with the distant thunder of Union and Confederate artillery echoing off the Cumberland Plateau, a different kind of struggle was taking place in the shadows of the Green Plantation. It was here, in the dim, flickering light of a rough-hewn slave cabin, that the story of Silas Green truly began. Not with a fanfare, but with a silence that was far more deafening than the roar of any cannon. The date was July, the air thick with the smell of pine resin and the iron tang of impending rain. Inside the cramped quarters, a young woman named Esther was fighting her own war. She was, barely out of her teenage years, a field hand whose life had been defined by the brutal rhythms of forced labor and the lash. Now she lay on a pallet of straw, her body racked by the agonizing spasms of childbirth. But Esther's pain was not just physical. It was laced with a profound, existential dread. She knew, with the heartbreaking clarity of her station, that the child she was bringing into this world would not belong to her. He would be born into chains, another piece of property recorded in a ledger, another soul owned by Henry Green. This knowledge sat heavy in the room, a specter haunting the birth before the child even drew his first breath. Attending to Esther was old Elsie, the plantation's midwife. Elsie was a woman carved from the very earth of Tennessee, her face a map of deep wrinkles etched by decades of hardship and witnessed sorrows. She had birthed hundreds of babies on this land. She knew the sounds of life entering the world, the squalling cries, the gasps for air, the mother's tears of relief and exhaustion. Elsie was also a woman of deep spiritual intuition, respected and feared for her knowledge of roots, herbs, and the signs that the universe whispered to those who knew how to listen. To her, a birth was never just a biological event. It was a crossing over, a moment when the veil between the living and the ancestors was at its thinnest. On this particular night, however, as the cicadas screamed their rhythmic drone outside, Elsie felt a disturbance in the air that made her weathered hands tremble. It wasn't the humidity. It was a coldness, a subtle drop in spiritual temperature that seemed to center on the child struggling to be born. When the baby finally emerged into the lantern light, the cabin fell into a stillness that defied nature. By all accounts of traditional midwifery, a newborn must cry to clear its lungs to announce its survival. Old Elsie prepared herself to smack the infant's bottom, to coax that vital scream from his throat. But the child, whom Esther would name Silas, did not cry. He did not gasp. He did not whimper. He simply breathed. It was a shallow, steady rhythm, impossibly calm for a traumatic entry into the world. The silence stretched, heavy and unnatural, causing Esther to lift her head in panic, fearing the child was stillborn. But he wasn't dead. He was watching. This is where the oral histories and the fragmented diaries of the time converge on a singular, chilling detail: the eyes of Silas Green. As Elsie wiped the blood and vernix from the boy's face, she found herself locked in a gaze that she later described in hushed tones to the other elders as ancient. Newborns typically have unfocused, wandering eyes, their vision blurry and their consciousness barely formed. But Silas, minutes old, stared directly at Elsie with a focus that was piercing, analytical, and terrifyingly intelligent. His irises were dark, almost black, and they held a depth that seemed to swallow the dim light of the cabin. It was not the look of a confused infant. It was the look of an old man, a judge, or perhaps something not entirely human, assessing its new surroundings with a detached curiosity. Elsie, who had stared down overseers and survived the worst of the plantation system, felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the night air. She wrapped the boy in a rough cloth and handed him to Esther, but her hands shook. She later whispered that holding him felt like holding a vessel that was already full, a cup brimming with a liquid she couldn't identify. The baby didn't nuzzle for warmth immediately. He lay in his mother's arms, silent, his head turning slightly to track the movement of shadows on the wall. This was the first sign of his otherness. In the heart of a war-torn Tennessee, amidst the suffering of slavery, Silas Green had arrived, bringing with him a silence that spoke of secrets older than the land itself. As the seasons turned over the rolling hills of Warren County, marking the passage of time in a nation tearing itself apart, a quiet, domestic unease began to settle within the slave quarters of the Green plantation. It was here, in the cramped, drafty confines of a wooden cabin, that Silas Green was growing from a silent infant into a toddler who defied every expectation of childhood development. By the time the boy was 18 months old, the anomaly of his existence was no longer something that could be ignored or attributed to a mere delay in growth. It was not what Silas lacked that frightened those around him. It was what he possessed. While other children of his age spent their days in the dust, mimicking the laughter and cries of their siblings, babbling in the universal, nonsensical language of infancy, Silas remained apart. He did not coo, and he did not wail for attention. Instead, he sat for hours with a posture that seemed unnaturally rigid for a toddler, his small hands manipulating pieces of straw or wood with a dexterity that bordered on the mechanical. But it was the sounds that began to emerge from his throat that truly chilled the blood of his mother, Esther. These were not the random vocalizations of a child learning to use his voice. They were distinct, guttural clicks, rolling rhythmic hums, and sharp, staccato hisses that sounded like nothing spoken in Tennessee. To an eavesdropper, it might have sounded as though the boy was choking, but Esther, watching him closely by the flickering light of a tallow candle, saw the deliberate movement of his tongue and lips. He was practicing. He was articulating phonemes that belonged to the harsh deserts of the Middle East or the ancient steppes of Asia, sounds that had no business existing in the humid air of the American South. Sometimes his inflection would rise and fall in a perfect cadence, mimicking the flow of a question or a command. Yet the words, if they were words, remained an impenetrable wall of noise. It was a language of ghosts, spoken by a child who had never stepped foot off the plantation grounds. Esther's anxiety morphed into a constant, gnawing dread. She would often catch him staring at the adults as they spoke, his dark eyes locking onto their mouths with an intensity that was predatory in its focus. He seemed to be dissecting their speech, analyzing the structure of their English, yet he refused to participate in it. It was as if he understood everything being said around him, the orders of the overseers, the whispered fears of the elders, the prayers for freedom, but chose to respond in tongues that predated them all. The other mothers on the plantation began to keep their distance, pulling their own children away when Silas was near. They sensed what Esther tried desperately to deny, that the boy was not merely slow or strange, but that he was a vessel for something else. It was Elsie, the old midwife whose hands were as gnarled as the roots of the oak trees, who first gave voice to this fear. Elsie was a woman of the old ways, one who remembered the stories passed down from ancestors who had crossed the ocean in chains. She spent her evenings sitting on the porch of Esther's cabin, smoking a clay pipe and watching Silas with a mixture of reverence and terror. One humid evening, as the cicadas screamed in the trees, Elsie leaned in close to Esther, her voice dropping to a rasp. "That boy ain't empty, child," she whispered, gesturing with the stem of her pipe toward Silas, who was tracing patterns in the dirt. "Most babes come into this world like empty cups, waiting to be filled. But him? He's full. He's overflowing. He hears voices from distant lands, places where the sun burns different, and the gods have different names. Elsie warned that a spirit had taken residence in the boy, a traveler who had walked the earth long before the plantation was built. She urged Esther to be careful, to guard her heart, for the boy belonged more to the past than to his mother. Esther wanted to dismiss the old woman's superstition, to cling to the hope that Silas was just a unique child who would eventually find his way to normal speech. But that hope was shattered on a stormy night in late 1864. The rain was hammering against the roof of the cabin, drowning out the distant sounds of the war. Silas was restless, his small body tense, his eyes darting around the shadows of the room as if tracking invisible movements. Trying to soothe him, Esther pulled him into her lap and began to rock him, humming a soft, mournful lullaby that her own mother had sung to her. It was a melody of comfort, simple and repetitive. Suddenly, Silas went rigid in her arms. He sat up, his gaze fixing on a dark corner of the room. The humming stopped. The cabin fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the rain. Then, slowly, Silas turned his head to look directly at his mother. His expression was devoid of the confusion or sleepiness of a toddler. It was lucid, sharp, and terrifyingly aware. He opened his mouth, and for the first time, a clear, distinct sound emerged. It was not a babble. It was a word. Kalath. He spoke it with a deep, resonant authority, the cough sound scraping from the back of his throat, the lath ending in a soft, breathy release. It was a word that felt old, heavy, and undeniably foreign. Esther froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't know what the word meant. Perhaps it was Aramaic, perhaps ancient Sumerian. But she knew with a sickening certainty that it was not a sound a 2-year-old child should know. In that moment, in the dim light of the cabin, Esther looked into her son's eyes and saw a stranger staring back. By the summer of 1865, the humidity in Warren County, Tennessee, was a physical weight, pressing down on the scorched earth of the green plantation. The war was over, the social order was fracturing, and amidst this crumbling reality, Henry Green walked the perimeter of his land, a man trying to hold on to a world that was slipping through his fingers. It was during one of these solitary patrols near the edge of the slave quarters, structures that now housed uncertain freedmen and those with nowhere else to go, that the impossible first pierced the silence. It was not a cry of distress, nor the laughter of a child. It was a rhythmic, structured cadence that drifted from the shadow of Esther's cabin. Henry stopped. The sound was alien to this setting, yet hauntingly familiar to his own past. As a young man of means, Henry had been educated in the classics, forced to memorize the epics of antiquity at a university desk. What he heard now, coming from a 3-year-old boy playing in the dust with a rough-hewn wooden horse, made his blood run cold. The boy, Silas, was murmuring, but he was not babbling. He was reciting. Henry crept closer, his boots silent on the dry grass, straining to hear. The syllables were precise, distinct vowels, rolling consonants, a musicality that belonged to the lecture halls of Europe, not a dirt floor in Tennessee. It was ancient Greek. Specifically, it sounded like a fragment of a tragedy, spoken with an inflection so perfect, so emotionally resonant, that it bypassed Henry's skepticism and struck directly at his memory. The cognitive dissonance was violent. Henry stared at the small black child, a boy who had never seen a book, never left the county, and yet was speaking the tongue of Homer with the casual fluency of a native scholar. Panic, disguised as urgent curiosity, took hold of Henry Green. He did not confront the child or the mother immediately. Instead, he retreated, his mind racing, and rode into town to fetch the one man whose rationality he trusted above all else. Dr. Elias Thorne. Thorne was a country physician of the old school, a man of poultices, bone saws, and absolute materialism. When Henry burst into his office, breathless and raving about a toddler speaking dead languages, Thorne dismissed it with a wave of his hand. He called it hysteria, a common affliction in these post-war times, or perhaps simple pareidolia, the mind-hearing patterns in gibberish. But Henry insisted, his desperation palpable, dragging the reluctant doctor back to the plantation as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the fields. When they arrived at the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. Esther was there, watching her son with wide, fearful eyes, sensing the approach of the white men. Silas sat in the center of the room, the wooden toy still in his hand. He looked up as the two men entered, his gaze uncomfortably direct, lacking the deferential fear expected of his station. Dr. Thorne stepped forward, his medical bag heavy in his hand, a skeptical sneer ready on his lips. He leaned down, intending to examine the child's throat, to prove that this was nothing more than a physical anomaly or a trick of the master's imagination. "Speak, boy," Thorne commanded, his voice booming in the small space. Silas did not flinch. He dropped the wooden horse. He looked from Henry to Thorne, his dark eyes seeming to age a decade in a single second. And then he opened his mouth. What came out was not Greek. The linguistic landscape shifted instantly. It was a stream of guttural, sharp sounds, rich with glottal stops, and a throat-heavy resonance that Thorne, well-read in geography if not linguistics, recognized with a jolt of terror. It sounded like Arabic, or something older, a Semitic dialect from the deserts of the East. Silas spoke a full paragraph, his small hands gesturing as if emphasizing a philosophical point, his tone accusatory and profound. The silence that followed was absolute. Dr. Thorne felt the blood drain from his face, the skepticism that armored his worldview shattered. As a doctor, he knew the developmental limits of a 3-year-old brain. He knew the capacity for mimicry, and he knew the difference between parroting a sound and constructing a sentence. This was syntax. This was grammar. This was intent. Cold sweat pricked at Thorne's hairline as the realization settled in. This child, born in chains in the American South, possessed a library of consciousness that defied biology. The boy wasn't just making sounds. He was communicating from a place that should not exist. In that dim cabin, staring at a child who watched him with ancient eyes, Dr. Thorne realized they were standing on the precipice of something that science could not explain and that religion might only fear. By August of 1865, the atmosphere at the Green Plantation had shifted from superstitious whisperings to a cold, clinical obsession. The phenomenon of Silas Green had breached the confines of the slave quarters, and with that exposure came a terrible price. Dr. Elias Thorne, a man whose medical curiosity was matched only by his lack of empathy for his subjects, decided that the chaotic environment of a mother's love was a hindrance to scientific discovery. He convinced Henry Green that to truly understand the source of the boy's glossolalia, the variable of maternal influence had to be removed. What followed was a chapter of cruelty disguised as research. Thorne requisitioned a dusty, unused parlor in the main house, a room filled with the stagnant air of the old aristocracy, and turned it into an isolation chamber. He forcibly separated 3-year-old Silas from Esther, dragging the terrified child from the only safety he had ever known. To Thorne, Silas was no longer a toddler. He was a biological puzzle box waiting to be cracked open. The doctor's methods were crude and traumatizing. He would sit the weeping boy on a high, stiff-backed chair, surrounding him with objects: a silver pocket watch, a dried tobacco leaf, a surgical scalpel, a porcelain doll. Thorne would hold them up, one by one, inches from the boy's tear-streaked face, demanding names, demanding definitions, demanding the voices to speak. "What is this?" he would bellow, his patience fraying with every moment of silence. "Speak, boy. Tell me what the voices call this." But Silas, overwhelmed by the sudden separation and the aggressive interrogation, did not respond with the compliance of a subject. He responded with the terror of a child, yet even his terror was anomalous. When the sobbing finally broke into speech, it was not the English of Tennessee, nor was it the comforting dialect of his mother. As Thorne loomed over him, the room began to fill with a chilling cacophony. Silas screamed, but his screams were articulated in tongues that had no business existing in the American South. He wailed in what sounded like a harsh, guttural Germanic dialect, followed by rapid, high-pitched phrases that bore the tonal complexities of Mandarin. He begged for his mother in words that linguists would later struggle to identify, syllables that tasted of ancient dust and forgotten empires. It was a terrifying display. A 3-year-old boy, eyes wide with panic, channeling the grief of 1,000 nations. Outside the heavy oak door, the scene was equally heart-wrenching. Esther, who had survived the brutality of slavery, now found herself facing a new, insidious kind of powerlessness. She was physically free, yet she was forced to stand in the hallway, listening to her son's alien cries echoing through the wood. She scratched at the door, her pleas ignored by the white men inside, who viewed her distress as irrelevant to their great experiment. She could hear the doctors shouting, the thud of objects being slammed onto the table, and the eerie multilingual chorus pouring from her son's throat. The plantation workers, passing by the main house, stopped in their tracks, crossing themselves as the sound of the demon child drifted through the open windows. For Silas, this was the moment the world fractured. He learned in that dusty parlor that his gift was a curse. He learned that to be special in the eyes of these men was to be an object, a thing to be prodded and provoked until it produced a reaction. The pain of that afternoon was not physical, but it carved a deep, invisible wound into his psyche. The voices he spoke with were not his friends. They were the reason for his torture. And as the sun set over Warren County, casting long, blood-red shadows across the fields, the crying inside the house slowly ceased, replaced by a heavy, unnatural silence that frightened Dr. Thorne far more than the screaming ever had. The boy had retreated somewhere deep inside himself, hiding behind a wall of 10,000 words, leaving the doctor with nothing but his own trembling hands and the realization that he had broken something he could never fix. Following the traumatic isolation imposed by Dr. Elias Thorne, the atmosphere surrounding the young Silas Green shifted from one of curiosity to a heavy, suffocating dread. The experiments conducted in the back rooms of the Green plantation, cruel in their scientific detachment, had fractured something within the child's psyche. But instead of silencing him, the trauma seemed to tear down the final barriers of his mind, allowing a torrent of the impossible to flood in. Silas was no longer merely a mimic, repeating sounds like a parrot in a cage. As the summer heat of 1865 bore down on Warren County, the boy began to exhibit behavior that defied all rational explanation. He was no longer just responding to stimuli. He was engaging in full, animated conversations with empty space. Dr. Thorne, sitting by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, his journals open and his brow slick with sweat, noted a terrifying evolution in the boy's linguistic capabilities. Silas would sit in the corner of the makeshift examination room, his small, scarred hands tracing invisible patterns in the dust, speaking with a fluency and cadence that chilled the doctor to the bone. Thorne, a man of significant classical education who prided himself on his skepticism, initially tried to categorize these outbursts as glossolalia or nonsense. But as he listened closer, straining to catch the syntax amidst the child's murmurs, the blood drained from his face. It wasn't gibberish. It was the complex, structured rhythm of ancient Greek, Not the sterile academic Greek Thorn had studied in university texts, but a rougher, living dialect, spoken with the casual speed of a native tongue. Then, the boy would shift effortlessly into Latin, his voice dropping an octave, delivering imperative sentences with the authority of a Roman senator. Even more disturbing were the moments when Silas utilized sounds that Thorn could barely comprehend. Guttural, clicking phonetics and rolling consonants that hinted at the very roots of human speech. Thorn, trembling, identified these as fragments of Aryan dialects, the proto-languages of the Indo-European family that had vanished from the earth thousands of years ago. The boy was not just speaking foreign tongues, he was acting as a living conduit for history itself, resurrecting dead civilizations in the humid air of a Tennessee cabin. The turning point, the moment that shattered Dr. Thorn's scientific detachment forever, occurred on a stifling Tuesday afternoon. The air was thick with the threat of a storm, the sky a bruised purple over the plantation fields. Thorn was attempting to conduct a standard vocabulary test, holding up a simple iron key and demanding the boy name it. Silas did not look at the key. He did not look at Thorn. His eyes, which Thorn later described in his private diary as two abysses void of all light and recognition, fixed on a point in the wall that wasn't there. The room grew unnaturally cold, a sudden drop in temperature that fogged the doctor's spectacles. The boy opened his mouth, and the voice that emerged was not that of a 3-year-old child. It was resonant, weary, and trembling with a sorrow that seemed to span centuries. Silas spoke a single, continuous sentence, his enunciation crisp and terrifyingly deliberate. Dr. Thorn, whose father had been a theologian, felt a shockwave of recognition. It was ancient Aramaic, the language of the Judean hills, the language of Christ. But the words were not of comfort or salvation. Thorn feverishly transcribed the phonetics, his hand shaking so violently he nearly tore the parchment. When he later translated the phrase using his reference books, the ink seemed to burn the page. "The waters are rising, and the red clay shall be washed clean of the sins of men, for the covenant is broken." This was no nursery rhyme. It was a prophecy of biblical proportions, a vision of a flood sent to purge a wicked world. In that instant, the dynamic in the room shifted irrevocably. Dr. Thorn looked at the small boy sitting on the wooden stool, a child born in chains, now speaking with the authority of an Old Testament prophet, and realized he was in the presence of something that defied the laws of God and science. The intellectual curiosity that had driven Thorn was instantly replaced by a primal, uncontrollable horror. Silas Green was no longer a specimen to be studied. He was a vessel, and whatever was pouring into him was vast, angry, and dangerously unpredictable. The doctor backed away, his breath catching in his throat, realizing that by prying open this door, he might have unleashed a force he could neither understand nor control. By the late summer of 1865, the secrets of the Green Plantation could no longer be contained within the property lines of Warren County. The whispers, initially confined to the slave quarters and the terrified musings of Dr. Elias Thorn, had escaped into the wider world, carried by the winds of gossip that swept through the post-war South. Dr. Thorn, whose scientific worldview had been shattered by the impossible linguistic abilities of 3-year-old Silas, found himself in a state of desperate intellectual isolation. He was a man of medicine, a man of facts, yet he was staring into an abyss that defied every textbook he had ever studied. Driven by a mix of fear and a desperate need for validation, Thorn penned a series of urgent letters to the most esteemed minds he could think of, men of science and men of God. He needed to know if he was witnessing a miracle, a medical anomaly, or something far more sinister. The response was swift, bringing two very different forces to the dusty doorstep of the Green homestead. First to arrive was Professor Alistair Finch from Vanderbilt University in Nashville. Finch was a man of cold, hard logic, a philologist of some renown who viewed the world through the lens of syntax and etymology. He arrived with a satchel full of dusty manuscripts and a skepticism that wore on his face like armor. To him, the rumors of a toddler speaking dead languages were nothing more than rural hysteria, a trick of the light played on uneducated minds. But close on his heels came a force of a different nature. The Reverend Elijah Blackwood from the neighboring town of McMinnville. Blackwood was a charismatic firebrand, a man whose faith was as rigid as iron and who saw the chaotic post-war world as a battleground between angels and demons. He did not come to study, he came to judge. The confrontation that followed, what would later be known in local lore as the trial of science and faith, took place in the stifling heat of the plantation's main parlor, where Silas had been brought like a specimen for inspection. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the air heavy with the smell of old paper and rising tempers. Professor Finch, treating the child with the detached curiosity one might show a rare insect, began his examination. He placed before Silas a fragment of a text, written in Coptic, a language dead for centuries. The room held its breath. Silas, whose small hands were trembling, looked at the parchment. His eyes, usually so full of that ancient, terrifying depth, scanned the markings. And then he spoke. He did not just read the words, he intoned them with a rhythmic cadence that Finch, for all his years of study, had never heard. At one point, the professor interjected, correcting the boy's pronunciation of a vowel. Silas stopped, looked up at the distinguished academic with a gaze that seemed to span millennia, and gently, firmly repeated the word, correcting the professor's correction. It was a moment of absolute, chilling clarity. Finch turned pale, his skepticism crumbling into a terrified awe. He realized he was not listening to a child mimicking sounds, but to a native speaker of a language that had no living native speakers. But where Finch saw a linguistic miracle, Reverend Blackwood saw an abomination. As Silas switched effortlessly from Coptic to a dialect of Aramaic, Blackwood's face darkened. He did not hear history. He heard the hiss of the serpent. The Reverend began to pace the room, his Bible clutched in his hand like a weapon. He interrupted the professor's testing, demanding to know who or what was speaking through the boy. The conflict that erupted between the two men was a microcosm of the era. The cold, rational desire to categorize the unknown clashing violently with the fervent, fearful need to destroy it. Finch argued that Silas was a biological marvel, a window into the human mind's dormant potential, a living library that must be preserved and studied. Blackwood, his voice rising to a thunderous boom that shook the window panes, countered that no human child could house such knowledge without surrendering their soul. He argued that the boy was not a library, but a gateway. Caught in the crossfire of this ideological war was Silas himself. The 3-year-old was visibly withering under the pressure. The constant switching between languages, the aggressive questioning, and the palpable hostility in the room were draining him physically. His head lolled, sweat beaded on his forehead, and his breathing became shallow. Yet the adults were too consumed by their debate to notice the child fading before them. The turning point came when Silas, exhausted and frightened by Blackwood's shouting, began to whimper, not in English, but in a guttural ancient tongue that sounded like the grinding of stones. Blackwood seized upon this moment. Ignoring Finch's pleas for restraint, the Reverend pointed a shaking finger at the boy and delivered his verdict. He proclaimed that Silas Green was a vessel of unclean tongues, a host for legions of spirits that had been wandering the earth since the time of Babel. The diagnosis was no longer medical or scientific, it was spiritual, and the remedy Blackwood demanded was absolute. He called for an immediate, public purification, an exorcism to drive the voices back into the darkness. The room fell silent, the weight of the pronouncement hanging in the air like a guillotine blade. Science had hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, faith had taken control, steering the situation toward a dangerous and inevitable climax. The air in McMinnville hung heavy that afternoon, thick with the humidity of the Tennessee summer, and a tension that felt almost physical, like a tightly coiled wire ready to snap. It was a spectacle born of fear and ignorance, orchestrated under the guise of spiritual salvation. On the dusty town square, a makeshift stage had been cleared, not for a celebration, but for a trial of the soul. Hundreds had gathered. There were local farmers wiping sweat from their brows, former slaves watching with a mixture of protectiveness and dread, and the landed gentry who viewed this as a necessary restoration of order. Among them stood a small detachment of Union soldiers, their blue uniforms stained with the dust of the road, rifles held loosely but ready, their presence a reminder that while the war was over, the peace was fragile. At the center of this swirling vortex of anxiety stood Reverend Elijah Blackwood. He was a man possessed by his own certainty, his face flushed with religious ecstasy, a heavy leather-bound Bible gripped in his hand like a weapon of war. And before him, looking impossibly small against the backdrop of the towering courthouse and the crushing weight of the crowd, was 3-year-old Silas Green. The boy was trembling, his wide, dark eyes darting between the faces of the strangers surrounding him. He was not crying. He was vibrating with a silent, terrifying energy. On the periphery, Professor Alistair Finch watched with a knot of nausea in his stomach, his notebook forgotten in his pocket. Beside him, Dr. Elias Thorne looked away, unable to meet the gaze of the child he had treated as a specimen, now being treated as a monster. Mr. Henry Green, the plantation owner, stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of grim determination. He simply wanted the noise to stop. He wanted his world to make sense again. Blackwood began. His voice boomed across the square, calling out demons, demanding purity, his cadence rising and falling with the fervor of an Old Testament prophet. He laid a heavy hand on Silas's head, shouting prayers that sounded more like commands. The crowd leaned in, breathless. For a moment, there was only the Reverend's voice and the rustle of the wind. And then, the dam broke. Silas did not scream. He did not beg for his mother. Instead, his mouth opened, and what emerged was not the voice of a toddler, nor was it a single voice at all. It was a chorus. A cacophony of sound erupted from the boy's throat, a multi-layered stream of languages that overlapped and intertwined. It was a sonic assault. Witnesses later described it as hearing a crowded room speaking all at once, but from a single set of vocal cords. He spoke in the rhythmic, guttural tones of ancient Sumerian. He shifted seamlessly into the melodic, sharp syllables of a dialect that Professor Finch would later identify, with trembling realization, as pre-Homeric Greek. It was a verbal torrent of incantations, legal codes, and prayers from civilizations that had crumbled into dust millennia ago. The effect on the crowd was immediate and visceral. People recoiled, covering their ears. It was too much sound, too much history, pouring out of a vessel too small to contain it. But the true horror was yet to come. As Blackwood stepped back, his face draining of color, the boy's gaze locked onto a figure in the crowd, a grizzled Union sergeant standing near the edge of the platform. The cacophony suddenly focused into a singular, piercing clarity. Silas spoke. The language was not Latin or Greek. It was a sharp, clicking dialect of the indigenous peoples of the Great Plains, a language thought to be nearly extinct, spoken by a tribe wiped out during the early expansion wars. The sergeant froze. His rifle clattered to the ground. The boy wasn't just speaking the language. He was reciting a name, a specific name. And then, in that dead tongue, he recounted a detail of a massacre, a secret act of violence the soldier had committed years ago in the territories, a sin he had buried deep within his soul, never telling a living soul. The soldier's knees buckled. He let out a strangled cry, his eyes rolling back in his head, as the past he had outrun finally caught him in the middle of a Tennessee town square. "He knows!" the soldier screamed, scrambling backward into the crowd, his composure shattered. "He sees the blood!" That was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Panic ripped through the assembly. This was not a parlor trick. This was an unmasking. If the boy could speak the languages of the dead, could he also speak the secrets of the living? The crowd broke. Men and women pushed and shoved to get away from the platform, screaming that the devil was loose or that Judgment Day had arrived. Reverend Blackwood dropped his Bible, his exorcism forgotten in the face of a power that dwarfed his theology. In the center of the mayhem, Silas's voice reached a fever pitch, a high, oscillating note that sounded like glass shattering. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, silence fell. The boy's eyes rolled back, and his small body went limp, collapsing onto the rough wooden planks of the stage like a marionette whose strings had been severed. He lay there, unconscious, a tiny figure in the dust, while around him, the town of McMinnville descended into absolute, terrified chaos. The silence that descended upon the dusty town square of McMinnville was not the peace of resolution. It was the vacuum of shock. Minutes earlier, the air had been vibrating with a polyphonic storm of languages that spanned millennia, a sonic assault that had brought grown men to their knees. Now, as 3-year-old Silas Green lay limp on the wooden platform, his chest barely rising, the atmosphere shifted from supernatural terror to a rigid, military panic. The reaction of the authorities was swift, brutal, and driven by a primal fear of the unexplainable. The Union detachment, stationed in Warren County to maintain order during the fragile days of Reconstruction, immediately moved to secure the perimeter. Under the barking orders of a terrified lieutenant, soldiers fixed bayonets and formed a perimeter, pushing back the stunned crowd with aggressive force. They weren't just dispersing a mob. They were trying to physically push back the memory of what had just happened. The official narrative was being constructed in real time, even before the dust had settled. The commanding officer, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat, shouted that the assembly was unlawful and that the crowd had fallen victim to heat hysteria and agitators. Henry Green, the owner of the Green Plantation, acted with the desperation of a man whose worldview had just been shattered. He didn't see a child anymore. He saw a liability, a dangerous anomaly that could bring the wrath of both the church and the government down upon his land. Ignoring the pleas of the few sympathetic onlookers, he scooped up the unconscious body of Silas. Witnesses later described the scene as heartless. Green tossed the small, limp boy into the back of his wagon and covered him with a rough canvas tarp, as if hiding contraband or a shameful secret. He whipped the horses into a frenzy, tearing out of McMinnville, leaving a cloud of dust that served as a curtain falling on the tragedy. He wanted Silas gone. He wanted the questions to stop. He wanted to return to a world where slaves were silent and physics made sense. Left behind on the makeshift stage, Reverend Elijah Blackwood presented a pathetic figure of hollow victory. He stood amidst the scattered Bibles and overturned chairs, sweat stinging his eyes, his hands trembling uncontrollably. To the confused and frightened stragglers, he proclaimed that the demon had been cast out, that the boy's collapse was proof of God's triumph over the legion. But those closest to the podium saw the truth in the preacher's eyes. It wasn't triumph. It was deep, existential confusion. Blackwood had looked into the abyss and the abyss had spoken back in tongues he could not comprehend. He knew, with a sinking dread, that what had exited Silas wasn't a biblical demon he could command, but something ancient and indifferent to his theology. He declared victory loudly, hoping that if he screamed it enough, he might eventually believe it himself. Meanwhile, the machinery of suppression turned its gears toward Dr. Elias Thorne. The doctor, who had been frantically taking notes during the outburst, found himself cornered by the local provost marshal. The confrontation was brief and menacing. Thorne was explicitly warned that any written record of supernatural nonsense would be seen as inciting public unrest, a serious offense under martial law. He was forced to close his notebook, his scientific curiosity crushed under the boot of authoritarian fear. The authorities launched a campaign of gaslighting that was remarkably effective. Soldiers and local deputies moved through the crowd, demanding names and forcing witnesses to sign hastily written affidavits stating they had participated in a disorderly gathering fueled by mass hallucinations. Most signed, terrified of the stockade. But ink on paper could not erase the trauma. There were those in the crowd who could not be silenced so easily, even if they never spoke of it publicly again. The Union soldier whose grandmother's long-dead dialect had tumbled from the lips of a toddler sat on the edge of a watering trough, weeping silently, his rifle forgotten in the dirt. For him, and for others who had heard snippets of their own secret histories or terrifying prophecies, the world had fundamentally broken. They carried a cold horror in their guts, a realization that reality was thinner than they had ever imagined. The town of McMinnville tried to go back to normal, but a shadow had fallen over the valley, a collective psychological scar that would itch for generations. Back at the plantation, far from the chaotic square, the final act of this tragedy played out in the quiet gloom of a slave cabin. Esther, Silas's mother, received her son not from a doctor, but from the rough hands of Henry Green, who dumped the boy on a straw mattress and left without a word. For 2 days, Silas lay in a feverish sleep, his small body twitching as if shaking off the remnants of a great electrical charge. When he finally opened his eyes, the terror was not in what he saw, but in what was missing. The ancient depth, the piercing intelligence, the otherness that had defined him since birth. It was all gone. His eyes were flat, empty, reflecting only the dim light of the cabin. Esther leaned in, whispering his name, begging for a sign, even for one of those strange, foreign words that used to frighten her. But there was nothing. Silas had survived the vessel being emptied, but the boy who remained was a shell. He refused to speak, not in Greek, not in Aramaic, not in English. He never spoke again. The voices from the dust were gone, and they had taken Silas's soul with them. Time, as it often does, acted as a heavy shroud over the truth, burying the events of 1865 beneath layers of silence and denial. For decades, the name Silas Green faded from the public consciousness of Warren County, Tennessee. What was once a terrifying reality, witnessed by hundreds on the town square of McMinnville, slowly devolved into a ghost story, a haint tale whispered by elders on humid porches to frighten children into behaving. By the turn of the 20th century, the boy who spoke with the tongues of the ancients had become nothing more than a rural myth, a distortion of memory that most reasonable people dismissed as folklore born of post-war superstition. The green plantation itself fell into disrepair, its fields claiming the wild, overgrown brush, the manor house standing as a rotting, skeletal monument to a fallen era. The truth seemed destined to rot along with the cypress wood of the old estate. However, history has a way of demanding to be heard. It was in the autumn of 1974, over a century after Silas vanished from the records, that the silence was finally broken. The last direct descendant of the Green family, a recluse named Julian Green, passed away without heirs, leaving the dilapidated property to the state. During the demolition and clearing of the main house, a structure that smelled of mold, wet earth, and forgotten years, a demolition crew made a startling discovery. Hidden behind a false wall in the attic, beneath layers of insulation and rat nests, was a heavy, iron-bound chest. It had been sealed with wax and lead, intended to never be opened. Inside this time capsule lay the fragmented, terrifying reality of Silas Green, preserved in ink and paper. We, the research team, behind this channel, have spent months analyzing the contents of that chest, and what we found chills the blood. First, there were the private journals of Dr. Elias Thorne. These were not the sanitized medical records he might have shown colleagues, but a frantic, personal descent into madness. The leather-bound volumes, brittle and yellowed, detail his initial scientific curiosity, curdling into absolute horror. In entries dated late 1865, Thorne describes the cold intelligence behind the boy's eyes, noting that Silas did not just speak languages, he spoke with the authority of beings that had lived thousands of years ago. Thorne writes of sleepless nights, haunted by the specific vibrations of the boy's voice, which he claimed rattled the very marrow of my bones. But perhaps even more disturbing were the bundles of letters tied with twine, correspondence from Professor Alistair Finch of Vanderbilt University. These letters, which were never meant for publication, contain frantic linguistic analyses that defy all logic. Finch, a man of logic and science, had transcribed phonetics from Silas's outbursts. In the margins of his notes, written with a shaking hand, Finch identified syntax structures belonging to Sumerian dialects and pre-Aramaic tongues that had been dead since the Bronze Age. He speaks of a hive mind sensation, a feeling that the boy was a vessel for a chorus of the damned. But the final piece of the puzzle, and perhaps the most damning, were the stolen military dispatches found at the bottom of the chest. These faded documents, stamped by the Union Army, reveal the calculated cover-up of the McMinnville incident. The reports, written by a captain oblivious to the supernatural reality, describe the event as mass hysteria provoked by Negro spirituals and heat exhaustion. They detail orders to intimidate witnesses, burn local diary entries, and threaten the townsfolk with imprisonment should they speak of the demon child. This was an orchestrated erasure of history. These documents prove that the fear Silas generated was so profound that the institutions of the time, science, religion, and the military, conspired to bury it rather than understand it. The truth was not lost. It was hidden. And now, as we piece together these fragments from the dust of the Green Plantation, we are left with a picture far darker than any legend. The boy was real, the voices were real, and the fear that drove men to seal these papers away suggests that they believed the danger did not end with Silas's disappearance. The final entries of Dr. Elias Thorne's journal, dated late 1866, paint a portrait of desolation that is difficult to read even a century later. The chaotic symphony of tongues that once erupted from Silas Green had been replaced by a silence so profound, so absolute, that Thorne described it as a tomb with the stone rolled shut. According to these crumbling pages, the boy physically recovered from the trauma of the McMinnville exorcism within weeks. His fever broke, his strength returned, and he began to eat again. Yet the entity, or whatever force had inhabited him, was gone. The terrifying, ancient depth that had swirled in his irises, the look that made grown men feel as though they were being judged by a deity, had vanished. In its place remained only the flat, confused stare of a traumatized child who seemed to have no memory of the languages he had spoken or the panic he had incited. He was, for all intents and purposes, empty. The tragedy, however, did not end with Silas's silence. It extended to the one person who had loved him before the phenomenon began, his mother, Esther. Witnesses from the neighboring plantations recounted that Esther fell into a state of melancholia from which she could not be roused. She had her son back, yet she had lost him entirely. The boy who sat on the porch of their cabin, staring blankly at the dust, was not the child she knew, nor was he the oracle the world feared. He was a shell. Esther passed away in the winter of 1868, officially from pneumonia, though the local freedmen whispered that she died of a heart fractured by a grief too complex to name. She was buried in the slave cemetery at the edge of the property, her grave marked only by a rough stone, leaving Silas alone in a world that viewed him as a broken artifact. Following Esther's death, the trail of Silas Green dissolves into the fog of the Reconstruction era. The official records of Warren County offer no death certificate for the boy. Instead, oral histories and fragmented letters suggest a convenient disposal of the problem. Rumors circulated that Mr. Henry Green, eager to wash his hands of the notoriety bringing unwanted attention to his land, arranged for the boy to be sent north. This phrase, often a euphemism for abandonment, carries a chilling ambiguity. Was Silas sent to a freedmen's orphanage in Philadelphia, where he lived out his days in anonymity? Or was he committed to one of the primitive asylums of the time, locked away in a damp cell, because his silence was as unnerving as his speech? The history books are silent, but the absence of evidence invites a darker speculation. This brings us to the most unsettling question of all, one that moves beyond history and into the realm of the metaphysical. Did the phenomenon truly die with Silas's silence? Modern analysis of Professor Alistair Finch's scattered notes offers a terrifying alternative. Linguists and pattern analysts who have recently gained access to Finch's archives have noticed something that the 19th century mind could not comprehend. The languages Silas spoke, Akkadian, Aramaic, extinct dialects of the indigenous Americas, did not appear at random. There was a mathematical rhythm to their emergence, a cyclical repetition that mirrors the propagation of radio waves. This has led to the vessel theory. What if Silas Green was never the source of the voices? What if he was merely a biological receiver, a human antenna tuned by some genetic or cosmic accident to a frequency that has always existed? If Silas was just a vessel, then the signal he received didn't stop broadcasting simply because the radio broke. The lingering whispers described in our title may not be a poetic metaphor, but a literal threat. The collective agony, the forgotten histories, and the warnings of floods and fires that poured through a 3-year-old boy in 1865 could still be out there, vibrating in the air around us, waiting for the next conduit. The incident at Green Plantation might not have been a singular miracle, but a glimpse into a recurring cycle of human consciousness that attempts to break through when the tension of history becomes too great to bear. The Civil War was a time of immense psychic trauma for the nation. Perhaps that trauma tore a hole in the veil, and Silas was simply standing too close to the tear. As we close the book on the strange case of Silas Green, we are left not with answers, but with a haunting possibility. The voices of the past are never truly silent. They are merely waiting for a tongue loose enough to speak them. Somewhere, perhaps in a nursery today, or on a quiet farm tomorrow, another child might open their eyes and speak a word from a language dead for 1,000 years. The story of Silas Green is not an ending. It is a precedent. And as we look back at the darkness of history, we must ask ourselves, are we ready to hear what comes next? Thank you for joining us on this journey into the shadows of American history. If you have a theory about what happened to Silas, or if you believe the phenomenon is still active, share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon, because some secrets are too dangerous to be kept buried.